Kimberly gently adjusted the blanket around her sleeping daughter. The little girl slept so sweetly, so peacefully, feeling protected with her mom nearby. For a child who had just turned 1, nothing more was needed for happiness. And Kimberly felt the weight of responsibility to protect her, to give her everything necessary for a happy childhood. When Kimberly first learned about her pregnancy, she hadn't fully grasped the responsibility that parenthood entailed. Perhaps it was because Corey, the father of their child, was by her side, and it was naturally assumed that they would share all the responsibilities and concerns. Kimberly believed Corey would make a wonderful father. He had promised. It was Corey who dreamed of having a child, who asked, who wanted to become a father soon. Kimberly would have waited a bit longer until they were more established, had their own apartment, but Corey assured her that many people lived in rented homes and still became parents. Everything will come with time, he assured her. Now is the best age for us to become parents. Besides, children are a powerful motivator to achieve something. Corey spoke passionately and convincingly, and Kimberly began to share her husband's point of view. She trusted him a lot back then and believed that everything he said was the ultimate truth. Kimberly had a complicated history. She grew up without a mother. Her mother died the same day Kimberly was born due to complications during childbirth. Raised first by her father and grandmother, and then only by her father after her grandmother passed away, Kimberly barely remembered her. Soon after, Tasha entered their lives. A woman her father brought in. He was tired of living alone, and feelings probably played a role too. Kimberly saw her father genuinely in love with Tasha, and she felt a bit jealous. Now her father rarely paid attention to her, focusing all his attention first on his new wife and then on their new children. Kimberly somehow ended up in the background. Initially, she and her stepmother Tasha had good, warm relations. Tasha enjoyed walking with her stepdaughter, dressing her up like a doll. She liked her new role as a mother and wife. Tasha had long wanted to get married, but somehow it just never happened. Tasha's friends had long been sitting with children, but not her. And now she had a family, a husband, handsome, non-drinking, earning well by the standards of their small town, and a daughter to boot. A beautiful, sweet, doll-like girl Tasha had dreamed of since childhood. And then Tasha had her own daughter, little Iris. Kimberly was genuinely happy for her sister, a family member. What a joy. But soon the girl realized her stepmother and, most painfully, her father, now directed all their attention and love to Iris. Tasha completely dissolved into her long-awaited motherhood. Kimberly was left with only short orders and reproaches. Reproaches for being too noisy, not washing the dishes, not cleaning her room. Her father would come home from work, greet his eldest daughter with a cursory glance, and then hurry to Iris's crib. He and Tasha would stand there, quietly discussing how the baby spent her day and admiring their miracle. Kimberly tried to join them. She also loved her little sister. But she quickly began to feel like an outsider. She was like a fifth wheel in this family. 2 years after Iris was born, Kimberly had a brother, Tom. Her father was overjoyed. Well, of course, a long-awaited son was born. An heir, pride and joy. Her stepmother also adored the little one. Now, Kimberly became something like a nanny for Iris. Tasha didn't care whether Kimberly had done her homework, if she had after-school activities, or if she wanted to hang out with friends. No. If Tasha needed free time, Iris was handed over to Kimberly without discussion. And then, when Tom grew up, Kimberly took care of 2 little ones. And she never received any gratitude for her efforts. But Kimberly longed for praise, for her father and Tasha to appreciate what she did. It was not easy at all to watch over 2 sweet but very active and curious little ones. You had to keep a close eye on them. Iris and Tom were the favourites. Her father's eyes gleamed with a special light when he looked at them. Tasha couldn't help but smile when interacting with the little ones. And Kimberly? She seemed to be an outsider in her own home. No one cared about her opinions, No one wanted to listen to her problems, and her desires, her dreams, were never considered. Kimberly got used to being in the background. It hurt. It was unfair, uncomfortable. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't earn approval. The girl intuitively felt that the atmosphere at home was shaped by Tasha. If she loved her stepdaughter, her father would treat her with more warmth. But Tasha, her heart was unreachable. And soon Kimberly stopped trying. Kimberly was already in 9th grade. She decided she would, no matter what, go to college after finishing high school. She didn't even dream of a university. She knew adults were unlikely to support her for that long. She wanted to get a profession quickly, stand on her own feet, and leave the family where she had become a stranger. Even Iris and Tom, when they grew up, began to treat their older sister the same way their parents did. She was a second-class person to them, and something like free help. Kimberly focused on her studies. It was difficult. She hadn't been paying attention to her lessons in recent years. A lot of housework, worries about her stepmother and father. The once solid B student quickly turned into a weak C student, and now Kimberly was diligently catching up. She stayed late in the school library studying textbooks. It was calm, quiet here. No one could make her clean her room, babysit the kids, or take them for a walk. In general, Kimberly accomplished what she once thought impossible. She improved her grades, passed her exams well. Teachers praised her, but her father and stepmother, as usual, didn't notice the success of their eldest. After all, Iris performed on stage with a dance group for the first time, and Tom learned to ride a two-wheeled bike. They had no time for Kimberly. The years of study flew by quickly. Kimberly now returned home late, preferring to do homework and prepare for exams at her new friends' places or in the library. That way, she had a better chance of completing her studies. The girl enjoyed learning. She absorbed the material easily and with pleasure, understanding more and more each day that she had made the right choice. She was eager to start working. Kimberly knew. She would be an excellent elementary school teacher. Practical lessons in schools only reinforced this belief. The kids listened to Kimberly, holding their breath. She knew how to find an approach to each one, even to those students considered difficult by other teachers. Her lessons were clear. She explained so that the children would surely understand everything. In general, the girl couldn't wait to start working. And almost as much, she wanted to move out from her parents, become independent, self-sufficient, and no longer feel like a stranger in her own home. So, after receiving her diploma, Kimberly packed her things and set off into her new life. Her stepmother probably sighed with relief. Finally, there would be no extra resident at home. Finally, they would live as a close-knit family of 4. Her father seemed pleased, too. "Right. Good for you," Tasha praised for the first time in her life. "Enough sitting on our necks. It's time to make your own way in life. But don't count on our financial help. You're an adult. Make your own way. And we've just started a renovation, so we can't help you." Kimberly nodded. By that time, the girl had already realized she was on her own. There was no help to expect from her family. No one loved her here. No one cared about her. Even the house she grew up in was signed over to Tasha and her father. The wise stepmother had taken care of everything in advance, ensuring nothing would go to the stranger girl, drawing up all the necessary papers. Kimberly left her childhood home with a light backpack on her shoulders and a small sum of money in her pocket. For the first time. She had been saving money from her scholarship for a year. It should have been enough to rent the simplest accommodation in the city. It would be the biggest expense, and Kimberly could eat very economically. The girl managed to rent a room in a shared apartment. Her first neighbors were a single mom with 2 rowdy kids and a retired couple who loved to argue. The walls in the old building were thin, the paint chipped off the walls in pieces and the floors creaked mercilessly. The most inconvenient thing was that the kitchen and bathroom were shared by the entire floor. The conditions were hard to even call acceptable, but Kimberly, surprisingly, still felt happy and free. She no longer needed to endure Tasha's nitpicking, her father's indifference, or try to please everyone. She didn't feel like an outsider or eternally guilty. Kimberly hoped she wouldn't stay there for long. She would find a job and be able to rent a separate apartment. Even if it was small, it would be her own, isolated. And then, a truly wonderful life would begin. Kimberly set out to find a job. She had a diploma, excellent recommendations from her teachers, and Kimberly was eager to work, to teach children. But she encountered difficulties she wasn't prepared for. In the private schools where good salaries were offered, they required experienced staff. Kimberly hadn't worked a single day yet. She was willing to be hired in some public schools, but the salaries there were almost laughably low, especially considering she had no experience. "You have to start somewhere," shrugged the principal of one such school. They were short on elementary school teachers, so she was doing her best to interest the young graduate. "You'll work a bit, gain experience, and then you'll get bonuses. Why rush? You have everything ahead of you." Kimberly just shook her head. The principal simply wasn't aware of her situation. Kimberly couldn't wait. She needed money. The girl almost fell into despair. She had a clear plan, a clear understanding of how her life would unfold, and now everything was falling apart, crashing against reality. Staying in the shared apartment for long was simply dangerous, with such neighbours. There wasn't even enough money for food. Kimberly needed a much higher salary than what was being offered, and the girl decided to try herself in a completely different field. Kimberly became a waitress at a busy diner. She was hired by Linda, a middle-aged woman with several locations in the city. Linda's diner was popular for its hearty meals and friendly atmosphere. Business was going well. Linda was opening new locations, so she needed staff. Working as a waitress wasn't what Kimberly had dreamed of. She wanted to teach children, see their curious eyes, answer 100 questions, and come up with holiday scenarios for the class. But Kimberly didn't give up on her dream. Not at all. She considered working at the diner just the first step. Kimberly planned to save enough money to rent an apartment for a year, and then she would get a job at a school. Even with a small salary, it didn't matter as long as she was a teacher. Everything else would come in time. Linda paid Kimberly well, and the girl also received tips. This was how the owner motivated her staff to work more productively. The work was, in principle, not difficult. The only thing that bothered her was the long shifts on her feet. It was also hard at the end of the day to clean up and prepare for the next day. By the way, it was thanks to these very shifts that Kimberly met Corey. That evening, the girl had just finished a long shift and was cleaning up. She was tired, her feet ached, and there were spots before her eyes. And, as luck would have it, there was no one around to help. The diner was already quiet. It was hard to believe that just a couple of hours ago, it was bustling with life. And then, "Miss, what are you doing? Why are you such a delicate girl working so hard?" Kimberly turned around. A young man was approaching her, tall, handsome, with slightly wavy chestnut hair and laughing eyes. A t-shirt highlighting his muscular build, blue jeans. It all suited him incredibly well. Where did he come from? Later, Kimberly learned that Corey was walking nearby with friends and saw her through the window. A delicate, determined girl working late into the night. Corey didn't like that picture. A delicate, pretty girl. And working so hard. He easily offered his help. Kimberly agreed with relief. She understood that she clearly didn't have the strength to finish cleaning up alone. Corey helped her clean up the diner as if it were just a regular chore. The muscles in his arms tensed and stood out. Clearly, the young man was involved in some sport. Later, Kimberly learned that Corey went to the gym. "Thank you so much," Kimberly smiled at her helper when the diner was finally clean. "You're welcome. Always a pleasure to help a lady, especially such a beauty," Corey replied. Kimberly felt herself blush. That compliment from the charming stranger made a strong impression on her. For some reason, she really wanted the guy to ask her name. And the young man, as if reading her thoughts, suggested they get acquainted. Just recently, Kimberly felt like a squeezed lemon. An entire day in the diner, and then cleaning up. But when Corey suggested they take a little walk, the girl suddenly felt a surge of energy. It was as if wings had grown on her back. They wandered the city streets, talking, laughing, getting to know each other. It turned out that Corey had recently graduated from university and was now working as an economist at a company installing air conditioners. The salary, as he claimed, was low. Not the kind of fees Corey had dreamed of. But what could he do? Without experience, recent graduates were reluctant to be hired anywhere. Kimberly understood this about her new acquaintance better than anyone. She found herself in the same situation, but Corey had his mother's support. He lived with her. She paid the bills, bought groceries. So Corey could afford to work for peanuts, but in his field, to gain experience and then really spread his wings. But Kimberly, she had to survive and fend for herself. She couldn't expect help from her father and stepmother. Corey, learning Kimberly's story, felt even more for her. "Now I want to protect and care for you," he told the girl. "You know, I really lack that." They started dating. Now Corey came to the diner every day after work. He helped Kimberly clean up and prepare for the next day. Then the young people would walk, sometimes go to the movies, sometimes go to a park on the other side of the city, or just stroll along the waterfront holding hands. Corey sometimes complained about strict bosses, low pay, and how his mother still didn't understand that her son had grown up and kept trying to manage him as if he was still 12. Kimberly supported her beloved as best she could. The girl was incredibly happy at that time. And why wouldn't she be? Finally, she had someone who cared about her. Corey gave her flowers, took her to cafes, and was interested in her affairs. It was so unusual and so pleasant. Kimberly's head even spun from happiness. Could all this really be happening to her? Corey moved in with Kimberly. By that time, she was already renting a normal apartment, a cozy one-bedroom in a residential area, not far from the diner. The shared apartment with dubious neighbors was a thing of the past. It happened seamlessly and naturally. At first, Corey would stay over. Then the apartment gradually began to fill with his things: a toothbrush, razor, some clothing. Kimberly herself suggested he stay, forever. She liked falling asleep and waking up in Corey's arms. She liked making him breakfast. She liked feeling his care and love. So why part when they could live together? Corey was happy to move out from his mother's place. "She's driving me crazy with her demands," he complained to his beloved. From everything, it seemed that Corey's mother was a controlling woman, used to having everything under her control. Kimberly was even a bit afraid of her in advance. Corey worked in an office. His duties included making calculations. The work was tedious, not particularly interesting, not requiring high qualifications. Corey's salary was 3 times less than Kimberly's. The girl worried he would feel insecure about this. She didn't want anything to cloud their relationship, but Corey just brushed it off. "This is just the beginning. Once I gain experience, I'll find something better. With my education, that's not a problem. It's just that recent graduates are reluctant to be hired anywhere." Kimberly agreed with every word of her beloved. He was right. She was in the same situation. But she had to go work at the diner because she didn't have family support like Corey did. And his mother, no matter what, helped him. Though she had many demands. But that's what parents are for. Kimberly wasn't used to it. Linda, Kimberly's manager, called her an infatuated fool. "Look how well your Corey has settled. He sits in an office from 9 to 5, shuffles papers, earns pennies, and doesn't strive for anything more. First, he lived off his mother's neck. Now he's moved on to yours." "That's not true. You're misunderstanding everything." "Me misunderstanding? Of course I don't see through people," Linda smirked. "You're wrong," Kimberly defended her relationship. "Of course. Answer me a few questions then. Who pays for the apartment?" "I do, but..." "Who stocks the fridge with groceries? Whose money is the food bought with?" "With mine." "Well, and him? What's his contribution to your joint budget? What does your beloved Corey spend on?" "He bought me flowers yesterday," Kimberly blurted out. And he ordered sushi for us for the evening. And he pays for his gym membership, Linda added, shaking her head meaningfully. Kimberly tried not to pay attention to the words of acquaintances about Corey living off her. That's how it seemed from the outside. But Corey worked. He had a plan. To gain experience, then look for a higher-paying position. He was still young. He had everything ahead of him. The main thing was that Corey loved her. He often told her so. Loved her like no one else. It was so pleasant to feel needed by someone. For this feeling, Kimberly was ready to endure any temporary hardships. The girl had no doubt the hardships were temporary, just Linda and the others. They couldn't appreciate the value of mutual feelings. They hadn't experienced, like Kimberly, feeling unwanted and like an outsider in their own family. So they couldn't understand how important and valuable it was to be with a loved one. Couldn't truly understand it. Time passed. Corey and Kimberly lived together like a married couple. The guy often said he was happy now. With you, I feel strong. I feel calm, good next to you. Not like under my mother's thumb. We understand each other with half a glance. It's incredible. I've never experienced this before. It's very valuable. Kimberly thanked fate for sending her Corey. Corey often left at night to see friends. Kimberly didn't know these guys. Corey didn't introduce them. But she accepted her beloved's lifestyle. You wouldn't be interested. Just my buddies. We have a men's company. Sometimes guys need to gather like this, you know. Of course, Kimberly understood. She liked that her beloved valued friendship so much, and the fact that he had many friends, that was a good thing. It meant Corey was a pleasant and sociable person. Moreover, Kimberly didn't suffer from a lack of his attention anyway, so it was silly to be jealous of Corey's company. One evening, Corey came home upset. Kimberly knew he was supposed to visit his mother after work, and so it happened. Again, I argued with my mother. She says I'm immature and childish. He shared his feelings with his beloved. Called me spineless. Can you imagine my own mother? She's always scolding me. Since childhood. I'm never good enough for her. I do everything wrong. She still thinks I'm a child, incapable of manly deeds. Corey suddenly fell silent, then looked at Kimberly decisively. You know what? Let's get married. Kimberly couldn't believe her ears. Her heart seemed to be squeezed by an icy hand, her breath caught. What? What did you say? Let's get married, Corey said more calmly and confidently. You see, I've wanted to propose for a long time. I just thought I'd choose the right moment. Make it beautiful and romantic, but it just slipped out. So what do you say? Will you marry me? Yes, of course, yes. Kimberly threw her arms around Corey's neck, trying to hold back the tears that had welled up. For her, this proposal was yet another and most weighty proof of the young man's love. Now she would finally have a real family. They began preparing for the wedding. These were pleasant concerns, though the young couple was financially constrained. It was time for Kimberly to meet her future mother-in-law. The girl was afraid of this meeting. From Corey's words, it seemed his mother was a controlling woman, used to having everything and everyone under control. How would she perceive a potential daughter-in-law? Especially one so poor, so simple. Caren invited her son and his fiancé for dinner. Kimberly was very nervous. She spent a long time choosing an outfit. She wanted to look both striking and sophisticated, yet restrained. Caren turned out to be older than Kimberly had imagined. It was clear she had given birth to her son at a mature age. Kimberly's father and stepmother were much younger. The woman carried herself with impeccable politeness, but she was cold. She was like an English queen. She spoke reservedly. She listened more than she asked questions. Kimberly kept trying to figure out if she liked her future mother-in-law. Caren herself evoked in her almost fear. The woman was already retired. Before that, she had worked for a long time as a department head at a factory. A managerial position must have left its mark on her. Corey said his mother had to quit due to illness. Something serious with her heart. But Caren looked quite healthy. Perhaps you rushed with the decision to get married, Corey's mother finally said. Why's that? Her son immediately reacted. Maybe you should stand on your feet more firmly. Corey, you don't earn enough to support a family. You're not ready yet. Kimberly was stunned, goosebumps running down her spine. She sat silently, not knowing how to behave. One thing was clear. Her beloved's mother was clearly against their marriage. The girl's premonitions didn't deceive her. Surely Caren simply didn't like the future daughter-in-law. Too poor, too simple. Caren was a former department head who had raised a worthy son, given him a prestigious and in-demand higher education. Of course, she dreamed of a different match for Corey, a girl from a prosperous family, perhaps the daughter of influential parents. And here was Kimberly. Corey was arguing with his mother, giving her argument after argument why he was already grown up and independent. Caren subtly switched the conversation to another topic, and the evening went on its course. But Kimberly's mood was already spoiled. After all, her mother-in-law didn't approve of her, and she had made it clear right then and there. The main thing, of course, was that Corey loved her. But still, Kimberly wanted Corey's mother to accept her too. Later in the evening, at home, Kimberly and Corey discussed the meeting with Caren. She can't control me, he was indignant. We're young. We decide how to live. They decided not to have a big celebration for the wedding. They just got married and then had dinner at a restaurant. Because it turned out they didn't have enough money for a celebration. Corey earned pennies. Kimberly's salary went to rent and groceries. Caren said she couldn't help the young couple, or maybe she didn't want to. She said her savings went to her treatment. Kimberly's father and Tasha immediately stated they weren't financially helpful either. They had just finished renovating their new apartment. But it didn't matter. Kimberly wasn't keen on a banquet, a white dress, decorated cars. The main thing was that her beloved was by her side, and Kimberly and Corey lived as a real family. In terms of everyday life, not much changed, but now Kimberly proudly wore a wedding ring on her finger and got used to her new, unusual surname. They rarely met with Caren. Corey sometimes visited his mother after work to pick up some things, just to chat. Periodically, the woman invited the young couple for family dinners. Caren didn't say she was unhappy with their marriage anymore, but once was enough for Kimberly. That very first time. At her mother-in-law's, she always felt out of place. Caren maintained her usual manner, cold, reserved, impeccably polite, like a prim dowager countess. She didn't meddle in the young couple's affairs. She talked about unrelated topics. The atmosphere in the house was somehow too tense. Kimberly always wanted their tea party to end quickly so she could go home. After some time, Corey brought up the topic of children. "We've been married for almost 6 months," he said one evening over dinner. "Maybe it's time to think about heirs." "It seems like it's time." "Do you want a child?" Kimberly clarified. She even caught her breath. She had dreamed of having a baby herself, but there were so many buts. "Why not?" "I've long dreamed of having a son. We'd go for walks, play soccer. I'd take him camping with me, like Tom takes his son. It'd be great." "But what about... A child needs a lot of money and we..." Kimberly spread her hands. She could have reminded Corey about the utility bill debts, about stretching money until the next paycheck, about how their apartment was too small and needed repairs. And it wasn't even theirs, rented, about the constantly rising rent prices. And much more Kimberly could have said. But why? Corey was aware of the situation. "Yes, I understand," her husband agreed. "Indeed, we're not in the best position now, but this is temporary. I'll find a better job." Then he talked. For a long time about how children are a powerful motivator, about how he'd move mountains for a child. It sounded very convincing. Besides, Kimberly had long wanted a baby herself. Many of her friends were already caring for their daughters and sons. Cute, chubby little ones. In general, Kimberly decided it was time. Financial difficulties were surmountable. She had a reliable and loving Corey by her side. He promised to do everything for their family. So why not? Soon, Kimberly realized she was pregnant. She was surprised and scared. For some reason, she thought it wouldn't happen so quickly. But then, she realized, and she was happy. Corey was delighted to learn about the pregnancy. He now took care of his wife more than before, bought lots of fruits, made sure she didn't lift heavy things. Every evening, he came to the diner at closing time and helped clean up. Kimberly had to leave work long before her maternity leave because she had some problems with the pregnancy. The doctor insisted on a more relaxed regimen. After all, at the diner, Kimberly had to stand outside all day in any weather, reach for high-hanging items, carry heavy trays. In general, working as a waitress was now contraindicated for her. The doctor claimed it could lead to premature birth. It was good that Kimberly had managed to save a small amount for a rainy day, because now she was left without an income. And Corey was still working for peanuts. He seemed to be looking for a more profitable position, but nothing was working out for him yet. Either they pile on so much work and responsibility it's overwhelming, or they offer training. Corey grumbled coming back from another interview. Despite financial difficulties, Corey wasn't in a hurry to give up meeting friends. He spent evenings in decent establishments, spending considerable sums. In fact, he was blowing his modest salary on hangouts with friends. And maybe not just friends. Kimberly suspected there were girls in that company. She heard women's voices when she called her husband. Corey, who claimed he'd move mountains for a child, was clearly not coping. And Kimberly's appearance upset him. Pregnancy didn't flatter her. She had pimples on her forehead swelling. Her belly was simply enormous. She couldn't even look at herself in the mirror, but it was still hurtful to hear Corey's jokes about her appearance. Kimberly wanted support and attention during this difficult period, but she felt like she was alone again. Her father and Tasha, of course, completely distanced themselves, and Corey was gradually becoming almost a stranger too. It was very frightening. Caren, the baby's grandmother, was completely occupied with her health. She often had to go to the hospital, went to sanatoriums. She had no time for grandchildren. One day, Corey blurted out in frustration that his mother had said something like, "2 kids decided to have a baby. Nothing good will come of it." Hurtful words like a stab to Kimberly's heart. It turned out Corey's mother never fully accepted her son's marriage, saying such things. It was painful and sad for Kimberly. And then Sydney was born. A bit early, but not critically. Small, fragile, loud-voiced. Holding her daughter for the first time, Kimberly forgot all her worries and sorrows. She had never experienced such joy. Sydney. Kimberly decided to name her little girl that. Little Sydney looked at her mom, as if studying her face, getting to know the closest person. And Kimberly barely breathed. She was filled with such love. Corey, of course, had dreamed of a son, but he seemed happy with a daughter too. "I'll teach her to play soccer anyway," he declared to Kimberly, taking the tiny bundle from her hands. Corey arranged a beautiful discharge from the hospital. Balloons, flowers, music. Caren also came. She handed the young mum a big bag of gifts. By the way, there were surprises not only for the newborn but also for Kimberly. It was pleasant, and even touching. Caren was glowing with happiness, looking at her little granddaughter. For the first time, she showed such strong emotions. Kimberly liked seeing that. Corey, his mother, they shared her delight, and loved Sydney very much too. But Kimberly's father and her stepmother never came. They were too busy. Lots of responsibilities with the kids and work. In principle, Kimberly wasn't surprised. And she wasn't even offended. They had long been almost strangers to her. The days went by, filled with caring for the baby, sleepless nights, worries about the little one. Sydney was fussy. Maybe her tummy hurt or something else. She cried often, slept little. This became a real test for Kimberly, but she tried to endure it stoically. Corey, though, it was clear he hadn't imagined fatherhood like this. Where had all his enthusiasm for having a child gone? The baby's cries didn't worry him as much as they annoyed him. He'd go sleep in the living room, close the doors, even put in earplugs, just so the noise wouldn't bother him. "I have work in the morning. I'm earning money. Don't forget that," he'd indignantly tell Kimberly. So you calm her down, I need to get some sleep. Kimberly didn't argue or take offense. Instead, she felt guilty for not being able to ensure peace at home. She felt like a lousy mother. So many responsibilities fell on her at once. The baby constantly dirtied her diapers, needed feeding on schedule, trips to the clinic, development and treatment, and daily walks. Sydney only slept peacefully outside. Sometimes Caren would come over, always with gifts. She'd smile at her granddaughter, speak to her in a gentle voice, and the little one would immediately calm down. Kimberly could catch her breath in those moments. Caren, despite her coldness and primness, clearly had a warm affection for her granddaughter. And Sydney, as if sensing this, would smile at her grandmother, reach out her tiny hands to her. Caren now helped the young couple financially a bit. She bought Sydney groceries, clothes, medicine, but she couldn't give much. The woman was seriously ill. Most of her money went to treatment, and she couldn't physically help the young mom with the baby either. Or maybe she just didn't want to. Kimberly was still guessing. It seemed Corey's mother adored her granddaughter, but she was still cold to her daughter-in-law. Probably, she still couldn't reconcile with the fact that her son chose a wife not of their level. By the way, Corey, who promised to move mountains for the child, wasn't very eager to fulfill his promises. He still worked at his low-paying, easy job. He didn't even want to hear about side jobs. He stopped going to interviews. "I'm tired," he'd explain to Kimberly. "I'm exhausted. The baby cries all the time. I can't relax at home. How can I do anything in such a state?" Corey increasingly didn't come home to sleep. He'd disappear for days with friends. From Friday evening to Sunday morning, bars, parties. Kimberly, meanwhile, was alone, struggling with the fussy child. Sometimes there wasn't even time to cook a meal. And as for cleaning, forget it. This annoyed Corey. "The house is always dirty. There's nothing to eat. I'm tired of hot dogs with pasta. It's hard for me to do everything. Sydney is fussy, her teeth." And how do others manage? Everyone has kids, but their homes are clean and meals are prepared. What about you? You're home all day. Isn't it hard to keep things tidy? Kimberly felt even more useless and guilty after hearing these words from her husband. She tried, worked herself to the bone, and still couldn't keep up. One day, Corey announced, "I want to live separately for a while." "What?" "My mum's going to the hospital again. She'll be gone for almost a month. I'll stay at her place for now." "A whole month?" "Yes. I need to rest, get myself together. I work hard until evening, and then there's no peace at home." Corey packed his things and moved out. Kimberly had a gut feeling it was the end. For some reason, she immediately thought of another woman. In the end, it turned out to be true. Corey really met a woman at a club. Jean was 10 years older than him, divorced, wealthy and independent. She had 2 children from a previous marriage with a major businessman. Jean worked as a chief accountant at an IT company, earning a fabulous salary. The woman could afford many things, including a young, handsome lover. Corey captivated her with his looks and charisma. It was no surprise. He still looked like a TV heartthrob. Jean could offer him money. Corey, beauty and youth. Corey invited his new acquaintance to his mother's apartment because she didn't want to invite him to her place, to her kids. Their relationship developed rapidly. Kimberly learned that her husband was at a luxury resort from his social media. Corey posted a selfie against the backdrop of a luxurious beach. It was painful. Not just painful. It was unbearable. And she didn't know Jean at that time. Corey didn't answer her calls. Corey returned. He came home tanned, radiant, somehow completely foreign. He explained the situation to his wife. "You see, I've fallen in love like never before. These things happen. You shouldn't hold me back. We're getting a divorce." "What about me? What about Sydney?" Kimberly was in despair. She was frantically thinking about how she would live now. The baby was just a year old. She was too little and too sickly for daycare. Kimberly couldn't work. She had no help to expect. How would she pay the rent? What would she buy groceries with? Corey's salary was small, but it still helped them stay afloat. Kimberly's own savings had long since disappeared, and Kimberly hoped that things would still be okay with Corey. She understood they were going through a tough period, financial troubles, a small child. But these were usual household difficulties. They would pass. Everything would be okay. It had to be okay. Kimberly dreamed that when Sydney grew up, they would walk around the city as a family, sit in cafes, go to the amusement park. And now what? Alone again. And with a small child in her arms. I'm crazy about her. It happens. You shouldn't hold me back. We're getting a divorce, Corey continued, as if not understanding how much his words hurt his wife. Then he added, we're not each other's property. And Sydney, I won't stop being her father. I'll help. Kimberly shook her head. She had big doubts about that. Corey hadn't tried very hard for the family even when he was her husband. And now, with a new woman, she shouldn't even dream about it. Corey packed his things and left, moving in with his Jean. He was probably truly happy with her. From time to time, photos and videos from parties and resorts appeared on his social media pages. I must say, Corey looked quite at home in all of it. And Kimberly, she was left alone with a bunch of problems. First, she needed to buy very expensive medicines. Second, the rent payment was due. Help came from where Kimberly least expected. One morning, Caren came to her apartment. It was strange. Her mother-in-law had never been to their place. It was always Kimberly and Corey who visited her. She looked pale and somewhat bewildered. Kimberly knew from Corey that Caren had recently undergone another heart surgery. She probably hadn't fully recovered yet. Just as I thought. It happened. The elderly woman shook her head sadly. Do you think I spoke in vain when I said Corey was too young to get married, let alone have children? I don't know if he'll ever grow up to such responsibility. I highly doubt it. Kimberly lowered her eyes. Did her mother-in-law come to reproach her? Corey is an immature person. He's all about partying. He married you just to prove to me that he's grown up and independent. No, we were in love. I know better. Caren decisively cut her off. At that moment, a sleepy Sydney approached the woman. Seeing her grandmother, the little girl smiled and reached out to her. Caren also broke into a smile. Next to Sydney, she didn't resemble a prim countess at all. Her mother-in-law picked up the girl, sat her on her lap, and started stroking her hair. I came here for a reason, she finally said. You and Sydney clearly need help. Am I right? Kimberly nodded. There was no point in denying it. She couldn't handle the situation on her own. I know you can't count on your parents. Corey told me your story. It's sad. Nothing more to say, but I was also an outsider in my own family. So, I understand what I'm talking about. Really? Kimberly was surprised. Really, I even had a stepmother. And 2 stepsisters. Her daughters. Just like in the Cinderella story. And I, just like you, once found myself alone with a child in my arms. The difference is that I already held a managerial position at the time. And I was much older, but still, so you see how much we have in common. Kimberly looked at her mother-in-law, as if seeing her for the first time. It turned out she knew nothing about her. In short, Caren decisively concluded, you and Sydney are moving in with me, for the time being, until you get back on your feet. Kimberly stood there, thunderstruck. Her mother-in-law, who had always kept her distance, they hadn't even really talked all this time. And suddenly, this... Caren offered help. And what help? Kimberly had racked her brains, wondering where to get money to extend the rent and not end up on the street with a child. It was a gift from fate. And once again, Kimberly's life took a completely different turn. With Caren, she felt comfortable and calm. Her mother-in-law, no, they never became close, but at least pleasant neighbours. Kimberly and Sydney were given a separate room, the largest and brightest. Caren would take her granddaughter for walks, giving her daughter-in-law a chance to rest, do her own things. True, the elderly woman often had to go to the hospital. Her health was deteriorating. Kimberly and Sydney would visit her there. Corey was wrong. Yes, his mother wasn't emotional, affectionate, or talkative, but she was reliable and decent. And that was much more important. The only downside was the constant lack of money. Corey lived his life with his new partner, enjoying himself. On social media, he posted photos of luxury cars, branded clothing, pictures from lavish resorts. Officially, the man wasn't employed. He had quit his previous job, so the alimony Kimberly received was a fixed amount. It was mere pennies, not even enough for bread and milk. Caren was ashamed of her son's behavior. Kimberly saw it. What can you do? Jeans. Her mother-in-law sometimes shrugged. His father was the same, drifted through life like a butterfly. Didn't acknowledge responsibility, didn't care about Corey. Disappeared as soon as he found out I was pregnant. And how many Coreys like him were there across the country? I never counted on him. I saw right away what kind of person he was. The child support Kimberly received wasn't enough to keep them afloat. Karen's pension went to her treatment. In general, Kimberly thought about finding a side job. But who would hire her with a small child in her arms? Sydney couldn't even be sent to daycare yet. A solution was suggested by Karen's neighbour, who was aware of the family situation. "My granddaughter started first grade this year," she said while walking in the yard with her daughter. Well, the question arose, who would pick up and drop off the child? My son and daughter-in-law work. We, the parents, live far from them. So they started looking for a nanny. They found a woman young on maternity leave. She stays with her baby. And now she looks after our Alice too. For decent money, by the way. And my kids are happy to pay her. The woman is good, decent. It's not easy to find a good nanny either. You could probably do the same. Of course I could, Kimberly beamed. How had she not thought of this herself? Listen, when you post the ad, be sure to mention you have a teaching degree. That's a huge plus for you. That evening, Kimberly posted an ad on several platforms. Calls started coming in right away. Kimberly thought it would be quick to find work once she started, but in reality, it turned out to be more complicated. Either Kimberly wasn't satisfied with the conditions, or the employers didn't like something. For example, not everyone was eager to hire a nanny with a toddler in tow, and Kimberly couldn't do it any other way. And then, one day, she received a call from an unknown number, almost not hoping for. "Anything," Kimberly answered the phone. "Hello," a woman's voice came from the receiver. "I'm calling about the nanny ad." The conversation was long and detailed. A nanny was needed for a boy named Matthew, 4 years old. An unusual boy. There wasn't an official diagnosis, but he was very withdrawn. He became like that right after his mother passed away. The little one was only a year and a half then, but he still felt and somehow understood everything. The smiling, open-to-the-world toddler turned into an indifferent, unemotional little person. Doctors, the best of them, worked with Matthew. His father had the money for renowned neurologists and experienced professors. But whatever they did, nothing changed. The child didn't want to communicate with anyone, except for a limited circle of people. His father, the housekeeper, Ella, who was like a grandmother to him. It was she who was calling looking for a nanny. Many nannies tried to befriend Matthew. He rejected them all, didn't want to communicate with them. But the boy needed to walk, socialize. School wasn't far off. They were desperate. "I'd be happy to meet Matthew," Kimberly replied. She found it interesting. It was like a challenge, a complex task to solve. And Kimberly really wanted to succeed. Understand, though, I'm not alone. I have a daughter who just turned 1. "That's not a problem," Ella assured her. "If you suit us, it won't matter at all, believe me." And so Kimberly stood on the porch of a huge mansion. It was like another world. A well-kept garden, gravel-paved paths, a small fountain opposite the gates. It was quiet and peaceful everywhere. Kimberly even felt a little worried. Ella abrió la puerta para ella. She smiled when she saw the toddler in the potential nanny's arms. "What a sweet girl," the housekeeper said, letting the guests in. "I really hope you'll stay with us." In the spacious living room, on a soft couch sat a boy. Tiny, very thin. Light hair, dark, intelligent, but sad eyes. "This is our Matthew," Ella said, patting the boy's head. "Say hello." The child didn't answer, but he did look at Kimberly. Kimberly gave him a genuine smile. Her heart ached with pity for this little one. Matthew suddenly jumped off the couch. He approached the potential nanny. He patted Sydney's chubby hand. The baby cooed in response and the boy smiled. It seemed like nothing special. But Ella clutched her heart with emotion. "It's a miracle," she exclaimed. "I don't even remember the last time he smiled at someone. Well, except for his father sometimes. But here, maybe you are the right fit for us." And so Kimberly became the nanny. Caren was delighted that her daughter-in-law found a job. "Well done, Kimberly. Now you won't be lost, even if something happens to me." She trailed off. "Let's not think about bad things," Kimberly pleaded. She didn't even want to imagine something terrible happening to Corey's mother. She wanted to believe the treatment would help. There wasn't much warmth between them, but still. Caren, Kimberly, and Sydney, they were somehow together, against the world. They held on together. Besides, only her mother-in-law extended a helping hand to Kimberly in a difficult situation. And Kimberly couldn't help but appreciate that. Every morning a car would pick up Kimberly. And Sydney. It would take them to Matthew. The boy eagerly awaited his nanny. She knew so many fun games. And, most importantly, she loved his Matthew. Other nannies, those others, were unpleasant, with cold eyes and fake smiles. He couldn't stand them. But Kimberly was different. Sydney. Matthew took care of the toddler tenderly, played ball with her. The girl would burst into laughter. Kimberly and Matthew would exchange smiles. The boy was thawing before their eyes. Kimberly herself didn't understand how she differed from the nannies who had tried their luck in this house before. Some of them even had psychology degrees. But Matthew ignored them. He didn't want to be alone with them. With Kimberly, he spent whole days in the park, played, learned to read and write. And Kimberly didn't put in any special effort. Maybe it was also about Sydney. Matthew behaved with her like a loving, caring older brother. It was sweet and amusing. Ella couldn't get enough of her favourite, and she became very fond of Sydney too. She gave her cute gifts, called her my dear girl. Soon the four of them became almost like one family. Warm and kind relationships developed between them. For a long time, Kimberly didn't see the owner of the house, the boy's father. He owned a chain of car dealerships and spent most of his time in the main office. That was the job. He returned home late. By that time, Kimberly and Sydney had already left. And then, one morning, coming to Matthew's as usual, Kimberly saw Andrew. For some reason, she had imagined him completely differently. Strong, tall, serious, a stern look, a severe crease between his brows. But before her stood a young man, slender, blue-eyed, smiling. The employer didn't evoke any particular awe, fear, or excitement. "Hello," he greeted. "Finally, I get to meet the person who worked a miracle with my son. Matthew now communicates with people, smiles, talks a lot, and he's learned so much. I've wanted to thank you for a long time." Kimberly smiled back. She was pleased by his words. And she was, of course, very happy for Matthew. Kimberly quietly left the bedroom of her younger daughter, Marianne, their daughter together with Andrew. Older Sydney and Matthew were still up, watching cartoons in the living room with their dad. Andrew loved all the children equally. He tried to give everyone attention despite his tight work schedule. Everything happened so quickly back then. Kimberly and Andrew met, talked, and immediately realized they were meant for each other, like a fairy tale. It seemed there was an age difference, financial situation, completely different backgrounds. And yet, both felt a connection from the first glance. At first, Kimberly tried to keep her distance. She understood how it looked. A poor woman with a child wants to latch onto a wealthy man. She didn't want people to think that about them. For Andrew to ever think that about her. But the man managed to make Kimberly overcome that barrier, and the stereotype suddenly became unimportant to her. And important. Important was Andrew. And also Matthew. Sydney. Their feelings. Her mother-in-law sincerely rejoiced for her daughter-in-law. Caren's condition was worsening. She feared Kimberly and Sydney would soon be left alone. But now, a reliable person was by her, daughter-in-law and granddaughter's side, and the elderly woman's heart was at peace. Andrew even helped Caren. He sent her for treatment at an expensive clinic. They found her a therapy and assured her she would live many more years. At least she'd have time to see her grandchildren get married. Kimberly was very grateful to her husband for this. Caren often visited the young family, or Kimberly and the kids would go to see her. The elderly woman literally blossomed around the children. She could talk to the thoughtful Matthew for hours, or play dolls with Sydney. She never got tired of it. And then Marianne was born, and brought even more happiness to the family. Matthew, being an experienced older brother, became Kimberly's best helper. And what about Corey? He lived his life, bright and beautiful. He still posted picturesque photos on social media, changed statuses, one more impressive than the other. And just recently, very recently, he called Kimberly. Corey didn't know about the changes in her life. He hadn't spoken to his mother for a long time, as she would immediately start scolding him for betraying his family. Eventually, Corey stopped calling her altogether. What was the point? Who likes to hear such things? And then he suddenly appeared. I want to meet, talk, find out how my daughter is doing. After all, I've been sending her alimony all these years. Though small, but still. Kimberly smiled as she listened to her ex-husband. She knew Corey very well, and understood what he wanted. Corey loved to show off and make an impression. He probably imagined his ex-wife was living in poverty with a child in her arms. And here he was, all handsome and successful. Apparently he was bored of thrills and ran out. He came for a new dose of surprise and admiration. Well, the meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning promised to be interesting. Corey and Kimberly agreed to meet at a cafe, the same one where they used to love having breakfast, back in the days when they both thought they were made for each other. Kimberly deliberately lingered a bit. Parking in the lot, she saw Corey through the cafe's glass wall. He was sitting at a table, fully dressed up. Kimberly smirked. Yeah, the hubby hasn't lost his flair for dramatic entrances. Corey glanced at the car. He couldn't see the driver. He just loved looking at beautiful cars. And then Kimberly opened the door, stepped gracefully onto the sidewalk. The surprised look on Corey's face gave her immense satisfaction. They didn't talk for long, but there was nothing to talk about. Sydney didn't interest Corey. As it turned out, he had no desire to see his daughter, which was for the best. After all, the girl already had a father. A real parent, the one who raised her. Of course, Corey deflated, learning Kimberly's story. He had clearly imagined their meeting quite differently. And now, such disappointment. He couldn't make the desired impression on his ex-wife. Kimberly left the cafe with a light heart and a smile on her lips. At home, her children were waiting for her, and her beloved husband, who had taken the day off work to spend the whole day with the family. Their plan included a visit to the water park, and then they should visit Caren. She had long promised to make pancakes. Matthew and Sydney simply adored them.